I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, digging into AI data centers.
Artificial intelligence, the defining technology of our era, is arriving. And the question is not whether AI will transform our lives, it will. The question is whether it will improve the lives of all Canadians or benefit only some. Our goal is AI for all. AI governed by Canadian values, AI accountable to Canadians, AI that serves Canadians. AI for all can make the jobs of Canadian workers more interesting and more rewarding. And done right, and we must do this right. AI in healthcare can mean shorter wait times and better service. AI in education can meet every child where they are. And AI in government can mean a government that works better for you.
That was Prime Minister Mark Carney speaking about his vision of AI for all at the 2026 Liberal Convention. Canada is injecting over $2 billion to support its plan to build national and, in its words, sovereign AI infrastructure. Just last month, Bell Media announced its proposed 300-megawatt data center near the Rural Municipality of Sherwood in Saskatchewan. It's anticipated to be the largest in Canada. But the public's response to that project has been mixed. Here's a clip from a recent CBC report.
More advanced but expensive systems.
But not everyone is convinced. One Regina resident says the environmental considerations don't go far enough.
We're going to see more greenhouse gases being emitted into our ecosphere. We're going to see the impacts of that. It did regard noise pollution and light pollution without any sort of a formal environmental survey being done.
At the same time, many data centers are being built in proximity to Indigenous lands. According to the US-based organization Honor the Earth's data center tracker, there are currently at least 106 proposed data centers on or near Native land. The Bell Data Center in Saskatchewan includes a partnership with the nearby George Gordon First Nation, whose lands purchased through the treaty land entitlement process through the city of Regina are located near the proposed site. However, the details of that partnership remain fuzzy. So, to try and get more information, APTN reached out to George Gordon First Nation Chief John Longman's office for an interview, but we did not receive a response. So, when Canada uses the language of AI sovereignty and AI for all, are Indigenous peoples included in that definition? And what are the costs, environmental and beyond, of AI data centers? These are the kind of questions that Dr. Mail Hogan, an associate professor in the Department of Film and Media at Queen's University, explores in her research and on her podcast, The Data Fix. And she joins me now to dig deeper into AI data centers. Dr. Hogan, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Pleasure.
So my first question, we see that Canada is increasingly using this language of sovereignty in its AI policy and press announcements. And I'm wondering, what does that sort of signal to you?
It's such a tricky question because I think it depends on which narrative you buy into. So if there's a real sense that AI data centers need to be built and need to be built at the scale and speed that we're being told by the industry, then there's an argument to be made for thinking about where those would go and who gets to decide where they go. If you're following sort of the AI industry closely, as I have tried to, it's very complicated, but I've been trying to sort of track sort of the vast promises and a lot of the hype and a lot of the concerns, especially increasingly around people who are resisting the build out of data centers through sort of more localized activism. There might be a question as to why we need those data centers built at all. So it's sort of a conversation that happens between sort of this urgency to build and to have it be not in the US. I think sovereign means sort of like in this moment, sort of protect from the US, but maybe, on within the Canadian border, versus as we have been doing for the internet now, where data centers sort of exist a little bit everywhere, and data circulates in kind of these global flows. So, so I think the question is sort of about how much we believe in this urgency of this data center industry build out, and sovereignty is this way to focus on the where rather than the why, the how, the reason for these data centers. If you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe going back a bit, how do AI data centers work, and what kind of justification is Canada giving for saying that we need more of them?
Yeah, I think there's a sense that AI is an important new technology, that it's revolutionary, that it is here to stay, it's inevitable, and that as a country, as industry, we can get on board with AI, or we risk sort of falling behind what everyone else is going to do, because there's a sense that everyone has to invest in AI to sort of stay current with this new era that we've entered. And so data centers have existed for a very long time, as long as we've had digital data. But if you think of the first Facebook data center, which was in Oregon in the US, that might have been the size of a football field. Now, Meta data center would be about 10 times that size. So that has grown in itself just for social media. And then we can think of 10 times that size for AI data centers, which are structurally very different to other data centers that have been powering the internet, because they require a different kind of power to compute. So different sort of GPUs, different equipment inside the data center to do more intensive calculations with more data, to put it as simply as I can.
Mm-hmm. And I think, a lot of the concern is around the environmental costs of these data centers, which is often kind of opaque. But what do we know about the environmental costs at the moment?
Yeah, and I think costs is such an interesting sort of way to even frame it, because it sort of is predicated on the idea that the environment is a resource to be extracted and exploited as sort of a kind of undebated starting point. And so it sort of depends on your sort of environmental politics in that way. But the impacts of data centers, again, that predate AI, but that AI has definitely, like, for the general public, I think, crossed a kind of threshold of acceptability, or of this kind of calculus of like, we're taking this much and what is it giving us? So people are struggling to reconcile how much energy, water, land, AI data centers require to operate, especially when they measure it up against what it's supposed to deliver. And in addition to that, it's like where those data centers are placed, whose lands. Often it's in disenfranchised communities. There's a lot of racism often informs where data centers end up. That's true in the US and very likely in Canada as well. There's also a sense of like where you would put data centers to get sort of the most out of the environment. So less humidity, more sort of natural cooling. Obviously, tax breaks are part of this conversation, and then some of the repercussions of that are higher emissions in those areas. There have been studies about the sort of area around the data center itself warming significantly. There have been questions about the water drawn, but also the ways in which, once it's purified, how does it sort of get outputted? So there's a lot of unresolved questions, and especially I think the one we're hearing about the most is the energy requirements to power something at that scale. So in addition to the noise, the emissions, the pollution, and the sort of entire supply chain of waste that could be factored into this conversation in a very local way, it's energy, water, and land that seem to be the impacts that most people are talking about right now.
Mm-hmm. And when we're reading these news articles about a lot of the proposed AI data centers in Canada, it seems pretty opaque in terms of what the impact is actually going to be. And I'm wondering, why is it so difficult to obtain any information about AI's potential energy use etc.?
This is not specific to AI data centers. The industry has always been protective and quite secretive of even though they had for a long time these kind of environmental plans that would talk about the ways in which they were becoming more sustainable. And Greenpeace for a long time was really tracking that. That took a turn when Trump was reelected and everyone abandoned their environmental policies. And I say that because most of AI data centers are based in the US, but this sort of impacts the industry in Canada as well and everywhere, is that there's a sense that those companies do not make that information available in a way to dodge scrutiny, but also because they think it reveals a component about the way in which it functions. So if you reveal how much energy you use, it might reveal something about your infrastructure. And so these companies are all competing, and so they retain this information in order to sort of protect the kind of proprietary nature of their build outs. I'm sure there's more to it than that, but in part is probably not feeling really held accountable and requiring to make that information available. So why would they? There are no consequences really, and then also they feel like it protects their trade secrets in some sense.
Earlier in this conversation, you mentioned, resistance against AI data centers. And I'm wondering, do you know of any examples in Canada or beyond Canada of Indigenous communities mobilizing to resist the construction of AI data centers?
I think, like specifically, no, this is something I want to, I'm applying for a grant to just look at, the resistance to data center buildouts across the country. There is quite a bit of this happening sort of coast to coast. I think in terms of Indigenous involvement, I was looking at the example that you'd sent me in Saskatchewan. There seems to be these sort of like understandings often signed, but like that's not a binding contract. And I wonder how that's going to shake out. I'm sure there's a lot of reluctance in terms of just like sort of the trust in that industry. I know with Wonder Valley in Alberta, I think there were a lot of false promises or like a real sense of encroachment, determining sort of the bounds of these projects with Indigenous communities. So I think we're seeing this unfold, and I think there has been resistance and should be resistance. If you're asking me for specific examples, I think it's sort of like unfolding as these plans are made public, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of resistance and sort of the Indigenous perspective being an important one in that.
Yeah. And so, in previous episodes of this podcast, we've talked a lot about how Indigenous land defenders and movements have been under increased scrutiny by Canada in this name of kind of protecting critical infrastructure, so to speak. Do you see this sort of expanding to Indigenous-led resistance against AI data centers in Canada, if that's how it ends up panning out?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say like maybe I can frame it slightly differently so I don't speak sort of outside of my expertise. And this would be probably more like a personal take than anything I've researched firsthand. But I think often people resist AI data center buildouts from an environmental perspective because that is something you can really sort of grasp onto that has some momentum behind it, built-in sort of concerns about the environment more generally. There's already an environmental sort of movement. And so you can latch on to something like that to say, hey, we don't want these, gas guzzling, polluting, that kind of infrastructure. We don't want it here. But I do wonder if underneath that, there's a sense that this industry has a kind of, politics that's embedded to it that people are also resisting without naming it. And so I don't know if this answers your question or it's way too complicated an answer, but I do think that we've seen in the US, which is the heart of AI data center buildouts, an alignment of tech CEOs with a fascist government. And so that is a anti-environment, anti-immigrant, et cetera, kind of politics embedded into that industry that I think will be interesting as a sort of political issue in Canada, given that currently, it seems like all political parties are on board with the narrative that AI is this inevitable future, I guess. So I guess it doesn't speak directly to your question about sort of the Indigenous perspective or the Indigenous resistance, but my sense is that it will like that will align itself with the resistance to the kind of fascism that risks being ushered in alongside that industry, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm wondering, in these resistance movements, what are some of, I guess, the strategies that have been forwarded, either within Canada or beyond Canada?
The movements against data center, I think it's very, very new. I don't know that there's been any sort of concerted effort to make sense of the ways in which everyone's motives and motivations are aligned in that way. And so I don't know. I think it's too early to speak to be able to answer that question. I don't really know. I think this is unfolding before our eyes.
I guess, yeah, everything just feels like it moves so fast that it's really difficult to get a grip on. Going back to this question of Canada using the language of sovereignty, it's also investing a lot of its infrastructure with Bell, which is a private company, to, build these data centers. And I'm wondering, is there sort of risk or like contradiction here?
I had the same question. So just before we jumped on, I was trying to refresh my memory about like, which data centers were being built, which ones were being promised. And Bell seems to be really leading, I think, the construction of, I think it was about like 6 mega projects. And I also thought, well, how is that like, how does that sort of clash with this idea of sovereignty and also the promises made um, to Saskatchewan about the amount of money would bring back to the province when really they're hosting or they're building this up for two other companies, which was like CoreWeave and another one that I noted down somewhere. But it's just like it's all industry sort of entanglements, and so I also struggled to see the idea of sovereign as anything but a sort of another layer of marketing hype at this point. And so it's not answering your question, but just to say I had the same question you had, where I was like, I'm sure people are flagging this. Um, or maybe it's this idea that Bell's a Canadian company and that as long as we sort of house Canadian companies within Canada, that in itself meets some sort of standards that has not been clearly articulated, I think, to the rest of us.
Yeah, I was kind of find that interesting as well. Do you think that policymakers in Canada actually know what they're talking about when it comes to AI, or is there a lot of just kind of bringing things forward, but not necessarily fully understanding what they're saying, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that there's a lot of hope and hype, and I think a lot of FOMO, which is a very hard thing um, to measure and to prove. But there's this sense, that AI is this next big wave, and if you don't get on it now, you risk sort of being left behind, or you risk not benefiting in the same way as the people who invest really early. But a lot of that is speculative. A lot of that is the makings of a bubble, as we've seen in other sort of bubble formations before, from the internet to the railroad to other things. The thing that's a little bit different about this one is it sort of feels also like there's a really emotional component of the promises of tech. So it's like, you know, if you'd invested early in crypto, you benefited a lot, and then it sort of like fell apart. And so maybe you're upset that you didn't sort of like cash out at the right time, or you didn't invest in the right stocks, whether it's Google or Meta or whatever. And there's a sense of like making quick money in these kind of tech investments that it seems like is also pushing this narrative forward. So there's not much evidence that, first of all, we need more AI data centers. Like everything we're using right now sort of hosts and holds like what people are doing, talking to chatbots, generating images, whatever it is that people use these data centers for, that like we have that infrastructure in place. And I think like probably the large majority of data center builds are for speculative AI projects. So what are they for? Who will they serve? And what are we pre-agreeing to? that's what I feel like policymakers in Canada like should be sort of drawing our attention to, rather than this hype of like, oh, if we don't build out, we'll fall behind. Well, what are we? Maybe we want to fall behind. Like, what are we jumping on board to, and why so quickly, and why so convincingly? So, I feel like yes, like I would, if I were a policymaker, if I had any sort of public role in this way, I would be challenging these narratives a lot more. I would require a lot more evidence to the societal benefits, promised of this incredibly costly venture. So, do they not know what they're talking about? Probably they're thinking about it strictly in business terms. And sometimes business means risking a bubble, I guess. I'm not an economist. I'm far from a business person. So my sense is to approach this with much more of like a humanities perspective, and something much more sort of gentle, careful, reluctant, and also maybe historically grounded, like what we've been here before. Like, why do we keep making the same mistakes, and what futures does it foreclose if we invest everything in that vision? I think I'm not here for it, for this big AI move, personally.
Hmm. So I wanted to close this conversation potentially, maybe on a hopeful note, but we'll see. So, I think a lot of people listening might feel very uncertain and powerless about this expansion of AI and data centers. And I'm wondering, where do we maybe have power here?
Yeah, it's a good question in general when we want to see change, but I do think that like the resistance we're already seeing to data center buildouts is growing. I've attended a few events um, that really speak to the kind of activism and the sort of community organizing happening around that, and it doesn't mean that everyone's on board or has the same sort of ideas about what needs to be resisted. But what I like is that it really shows people who make, like, it really sort of reveals who gets to make decisions for us in these big ways, what the processes are, who's sort of involved. And so if you come closer to sort of resisting a data center in your own neighborhood or municipality, you come closer also to understanding how other sort of things um, shape the future around you. So I think there's a moment of drawing people into this kind of community building, community activism that is really interesting. And then in and through these connections with other people, you may sort of come to think of AI differently. You might learn more about who owns it, what kind of what kind of futures they imagine. You just might sort of enrich your understanding of it. And I do think it's really effective. I think working together in community is really effective. And I have a sense, and I don't know, we all live in our little bubbles, but I do have a sense that people are more resistant, not to AI, like you don't have to love or hate AI. It can be a complex, nuance or like feeling, but a lot more reluctant to handing over the entirety of the planet, all of our energy, all of our resources, all of our energies, all of our emotions to that industry per se, because there can be iterations of generative AI, like large language models, the technology used in very different ways, let's say based on proprietary data sets for climate modeling. And so it's not scraping the entirety of the internet and producing these large commercial AI services like ChatGPT and so on. The technology is one thing, the industry is another. And I think it's just to start to nuance those things, and then to maybe sort of appreciate innovation scientifically, and to reject a little bit more sort of the profit for profit's sake, the sort of and narratives of endless growth, and the sort of techno-fascism that has sort of really taken over. So I don't know. I find that we're weirdly in a hopeful moment, because my sense is not at all that everyone is fully embracing AI, and that we're actually able to imagine other futures, better futures, that aren't led by the same old sort of few rich white guys sort of dictating what the rest of us get to think about. So I don't know. Maybe I'm especially grim, and that is hopeful to me, not hopeful enough. But I sort of wish I could ask you the same question. Just what version of this is hopeful? Is it that AI does reveal itself to be this great fixer of all things, or that we organize against it and produce a different future more aligned with other sets of values that are more about the environment, more about a different kind of, care for the planet that we live on. So I don't know. I guess it depends on your definition of hope.
Thanks so much again for making the time. Really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Mail Hogan is an associate professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies at Queen's University and the host of the DataFix podcast.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff Ward from Animikii Indigenous Technology. I support Indigenous communities in North America, supporting Indigenous data sovereignty. And I was really pleased to hear other impacts around like economic impacts and how we might maybe measure this as well. This is, hidden costs of AI with a focus on environment, energy, and water. But I'm curious if anybody has measured or considered adding measurements of socio-technical and economic impacts, for example, with Indigenous peoples. Anna mentioned the cloud is just somebody else's computer. And something to add to that might be the cloud is also on somebody's Indigenous land somewhere. And so it'd be interesting, I'm hearing in measuring the whole stack from the hardware level, system level, inference, and even measuring the cost of not using AI. That was really interesting. But within the Indigenous context, I'd say I'd also encourage those looking to measure environmental impact to include Indigenous voices, because Indigenous peoples globally are the original land and water protectors and need to be consulted from a rights-based approach, and I'd say even a human rights approach. Some of the Indigenous groups that we're supporting with are telling us that they are literally fighting data centers on their lands.
That was Animikii Indigenous Technology CEO Jeff Ward speaking about the hidden costs of AI at an AI Action Summit in Paris last February. You also might remember him from a previous InFocus episode on Indigenous data sovereignty in the age of big tech. We thought it would be a good idea to bring him back for this episode, so he joins me now to talk more about what AI data centers mean for Indigenous peoples. Jeff Ward, it's great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
So to start off, last February you spoke at the AI Action Summit in Paris about the impacts of AI to land, water, and Indigenous peoples. And I'm wondering, why was it important to bring these issues to a global stage?
Because on the global stage is where the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples really connect Indigenous movements, Indigenous rights globally. And in that room in particular, that conversation didn't have an Indigenous perspective. So I wanted to make sure to share that we think about water as a relative. We think about the impacts of, for example, AI data centers on the water and on the land and within Indigenous communities, and that's globally.
Mm-hmm. And so what do we know about the environmental impact of AI and AI data centers?
Well, AI needs an incredible amount of data, first of all. So there's the training part of that. That's what everything that happens before it makes it to your ChatGPT prompt, for example. And then there's when you actually type in your prompt, it's got to go and now process your text, your data, mash it with the LLM's data, and do an incredible amount of processing. That processing is a very physical thing. Bits and bytes need to move around, pieces of hardware. Those hardware live in data centers, and those computers, those chips, they heat up and they need to be cooled. And so that is why data centers need a lot of water. And at the scale of how hyperscalers, so-called hyperscalers, are growing, they're taking up just immense amount of land, and the land that they do take up are taking an immense amount of energy to run all of that, and that is impacting local communities.
And on the note of communities, why are we seeing, many AI data centers being constructed on or near Indigenous lands?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the companies that are building data centers are approaching First Nations or approaching Indigenous communities because they see an economic opportunity, right? There's this AI boom, and if you're in the business of making data centers, you're going to try and find land and partners that are willing to work with you to invest in this business. And so I think it's we have a lot of companies, large corporations that have sought to work with Indigenous communities for such a long time, right? And so it's sort of the next business opportunity that primarily non-Indigenous, big technology companies are seeing an opportunity where can they find land, and where can they do that at as lowest cost as possible.
So with those partnerships, do you think there's a sense, or do you get the sense that they're mutually beneficial?
I think there are great cases out there where there have been nations that have prospered economically with partnerships with other industries. And I think there's also a lot of cases where those relationships, while on the surface appear as a good economic opportunity, at the end of the day can be quite extractive, right? And my worry with how fast the movement towards hyperscalers are going and the massive amount of investment that is going into creating these large data centers, that when partnerships are happening with Indigenous communities, with First Nations communities, for example, that you see this like typical 51%, 49% partnership in many other industries, and we're seeing that with data center projects. And my worry is that when there is a market correction or data centers are overbuilt compared to demand, for example, if there's a market correction, I worry that it's going to be First Nation communities that are going to be left there holding the bag and all of the risk and all of that. So I don't have any visibility into the actual economics of how nations are negotiating this, but yeah, it's something that I'm concerned about.
We see Canada using a lot of sovereignty language in its AI policy and the press releases that it puts out about these different data center projects. And I'm wondering, do you think this includes considerations of Indigenous sovereignty?
Yeah, sovereignty means sovereignty, right? And so, we talk a lot about nation-to-nation relationships. That's sovereignty to sovereignty, right? And so that must include not just governance over land and communities and membership and taking a rights-based approach to everything. This includes a rights-based approach to data and also data governance.
And I guess kind of related to that, last time you were on this podcast, we talked about Indigenous data sovereignty. And I'm wondering, how does that factor into these conversations about AI data centers?
Yeah, Indigenous data sovereignty means communities control how their data is used, right? And AI just needs an immense amount of data. And when we think about Indigenous data, it's directly tied to culture, to self-determination. And so if that data is including Indigenous knowledges and languages without safeguards, that data can be extracted and misused. And AI is accelerating and amplifying that extraction and misuse of data. So, as an Indigenous technology company at Animikii, we build software and data platforms. Our data platform is called NEWIN, and it respects Indigenous data sovereignty principles. And there's many layers to the digital stack, from your data governance, the design of your data, but also where your data is hosted. And communities need to have choice over where their data is hosted and how those data sharing agreements might work, including keeping data completely safe and protected from, for example, AI systems that extract data at scale.
We're also seeing more and more Indigenous-led AI initiatives, and I'm wondering, how are they different from models that are being developed by big tech companies?
Yeah, I'm part of quite a few Indigenous AI communities, and there are amazing folks thinking about all kinds of aspects of AI development, hosting, governance, all of these kinds of things, using small language models for language revitalization, for example. And we hear a lot about AI being, to a lot of people, AI is ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot, these kinds of things, and a lot of people within the Indigenous AI community are looking of how might we leverage these tools for what they're good at, especially as language models or machine learning concepts, and how might we consider the risks that are inherent in these technologies, as there are risks in all technologies, right? And AI, I think, is a little bit different and is amplifying some of these risks. But yeah, so thinking about how might you leverage these tools, but use, for example, locally hosted models, AI models, using open source or open weight models, so that you can use AI locally without data ever leaving your computer, for example. You can run these things fully offline. And how can you look at bias that is inherent in these language models and try to identify and maybe put up some protections or guardrails around what AI is producing to the end user.
And kind of going back to the environmental question, do are there any sort of ways to encode environmental limits into AI systems?
When I think about that question, limits, I think about like how can you track usage, for example, at that OECD roundtable that you played the clip of. Around that table or in that room, there was a group that allowed you to connect measurement into how much your software or your AI is using. And so I think from an impact measurement perspective, you might want communities might want to think about what is their impact, measuring impact, because you can't govern or change or look at policy without the tracking piece of that, so that you can understand if any improvements or any risk mitigation that you're making is changing anything. So that's something I'd recommend.
Yeah, and I guess just as a closing question, what do you think are some ways forward for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities, in this age of AI and the expansion with these data centers?
Yeah, well, I think communities shouldn't carry the costs without building the capacity to learn and lead. And we have so much knowledge from looking at from a rights-based perspective, how do we build these technologies, and how do we build the not only the technology infrastructure, but because I think communities are absorbing the environmental and maybe infrastructure pressures like strain on water and power and these kinds of things. But how might Indigenous peoples lead in the development of these technologies, in supporting these technologies in communities, from digital skills training, workforce development, education around these technologies, because Indigenous nations should have access to these to the resourcing tools and training needed to participate in and govern from a rights-based perspective, but and lead in the AI economy over the long term. I think as Indigenous peoples, technology and AI needs an Indigenous worldview. And when we think about the impacts in our lands and in our waters over the long term, this is my worry right now, is that if AI, is the future, so to speak, Indigenous communities need to be partners in building it, not just being impacted by it.
Jeff Ward, thank you so much for joining us again. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you so much.
Jeff Ward is the CEO of Animikii Indigenous Technology. APTN also reached out to Canada's AI Minister Evan Solomon for an interview on multiple occasions, but never received a response. This episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Stricker is the executive producer of APTN News InFocus. We want to know if you're enjoying the show. Please leave a rating and review on your favorite player or email suggestions to infocus@aptn.ca. Also, give us a follow. It helps other people find the show. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Hello, I'm Rick Harp, host of APTN News Brief, a daily podcast version of the nightly broadcast of APTN National News. Available on all major podcast platforms, APTN News Brief is your quick way to hear the headlines every weekday morning. Learn more at aptnnews.ca/podcasts.